Page 308. Many human beings erroneously or imperiously believe themselves to be great psychologists and great helpers in the matters of humaneness, and so forth, and think, in their delusion concerning this, that they are in fact able to stand by and help others, which, however, as a rule, has devastating results and destructive effects for those who turn towards the dubious help. Concerning this, it is certainly the obligation of every single human being to only turn to others with help, and to only concern themselves with others and make themselves commendable to them, when they are first and foremost able to help themselves, which can, however, only be right when they have brought their own nature and their own personality onto a level of development which is of a kind and wise in true conformity with creation. Therefore, this stipulates that the human being first and foremost concerns himself or herself with his or her entirely own inner and outer matters, and brings them into order in a true conformity with creation. This is a fundamental recommendation, because every human being is obliged, first and foremost, to form himself or herself according to the creational impulses and guidelines pre-given by his or her innermost nature, in order to be evolutive and become a true human being. Therefore, the human being firstly has to evolutively form his or her own self, and with that, his or her own consciousness, in order to then live according to it, because one's own evolution is the most important thing in the life of the human being, because a creational law is thereby fulfilled, through which creation itself further evolves. Therefore, it is the human being's obligation to direct and progressively form, according to the creational innermost nature, his or her inner nature, which must be formed by him or her. And only when this has happened, in the best possible form, can he or she turn to his or her fellow human being in effectively helpful form, and, in fact, give him or her those values which he or she requires. Therefore, it is not done by wanting to be helpful to others by showing the way in things to do with consciousness evolution, as well as with psychology and so forth, when the necessary abilities for that have not been achieved. Yet, directly in this regard, many believe themselves to be qualified and wise enough, although they cannot cope with themselves, whereby they cause enormous harm to their fellow human beings. Erroneously or arrogantly, they believe that they have to intervene in the matters, problems, and troubles, and so forth, of others, and assist them by giving their wrong advice, and so forth, whereby they often cause harm which cannot be repaired again. When it is said here that the human being should, as the very first thing, be concerned and evolutive for himself or herself, that in no wise means that a selfishness and egocentricity and so forth may be seen in that. In fact, this evolutive concern and evolutive work on oneself, on one's own inner nature, and on all other self-oriented factors, has nothing to do with the bad value which arises in the purely negative saying, quote, everyone is his or her own neighbor, or i.e., quote, look out for number one. In fact, one's neighbor is always one's fellow human being, to whom due deference must always be given in every regard, and indeed as a human being. But that does not mean that evil, negative, and bad actions, as well as wrong actions, have to be accepted, because one is not obliged to respect them. However, one is most certainly obliged to respect the human being as such. If the human being, therefore, concerns himself or herself first and foremost with his or her own inner and outer well-being, then that happens in the fulfillment of the obligation that the human being, first and foremost, and in every regard, must fulfill and master his or her own life, for which reason he or she has to direct all attention firstly onto himself or herself, whereby he or she is, however, simultaneously conscious of his or her obligation and responsibility to respect his or her neighbor. In this regard, appropriate material help is then indeed fitting, which certainly has especially nothing to do with false, negative, and inadequate advice from a wrongly developed inner nature and from a wrong personality and morality, and so forth. Yet material help should not be given to the needy out of pity or because of pangs of conscience and the like. Rather, it should be purely for reasons of love, fairness, true humaneness, feelings for others, and a feeling of responsibility for one's neighbor. If the human being wants to progress in his or her inner nature, personality, character, and in his or her morality, as well as in love, inner freedom, in peace, in love for his or her neighbor, in real joy of life, and in harmony, and if he or she wants to climb to higher values, then that requires not only inner efforts and the might of thoughts and words, by means of which everything is able to come into existence. Rather, it also requires the external necessities, which are expressed in prosperity and abundance. But prosperity and abundance in the material realm must not necessarily be equated with material wealth, rather solely with the material necessities, which are required for the forming and conducting one's life. These are naturally fundamentally different depending on the human being and his or her demands. Consequently, one human being manages with the most minimal of means because all his or her demands are very modest, while the other has immodest demands and requires more in order to eke out an existence and to satisfy all his or her wishes, and so forth. Prosperity and abundance, in the material sense, are therefore necessary in order to also be able to create prosperity and abundance in the inner part of the human being. Consequently, in this regard, it is also the case that the human being must see to it, right from the start, that he or she has, for himself or herself, the necessary amount of all things of a material kind at his or her disposal, which he or she requires for the well-being of his or her body and all factors associated with that. And only when this necessity is fulfilled can something also be done for one's neighbors, in order to give material assistance to them and alleviate eventual hardship. The human being who has to live with very meager means, and only has very little, can also only give very little. The human being who has much can also be helpful with much. Yet the human being who has too little can give nothing of it, because otherwise he or she endangers his or her own life under certain circumstances, which is not in the sense of the good and positive, and is thereby also not right, because the law of the life exists in the advice that the life must be maintained in order to evolve to that which is higher. Therefore, to be selfless does not mean to disadvantage oneself, or indeed to endanger one's life. Rather, it solely means to be unselfish, and not to be concerned about one's own advantage. Rather, to altruistically live magnanimously, and from this, to responsibly fulfill the obligation of the pure humaneness. However, it is only possible to achieve this selflessness through knowledge and wisdom, in fulfillment of the therewith connected creational natural laws, which, however, is truthfully only possible for few human beings, and indeed only just those who live by following the laws of the life. Normally, with most human beings, it is unfortunately the case that their knowledge and their wisdom only extend just as far as their own worries and their own advantage. But if the human being wants to really be knowing and wise in the creational natural sense, then he or she must concern himself or herself with the evolution and conduct his or her life according to the neutral, positive, equalized laws of life, and only from that arise all those values which actually make the human being into a real human being who lives in cognition and fulfillment. The true cognition and the greatest fulfillment are thereby the genuine happiness of the love, of the joy and freedom, as well as of the harmony, of the true friendship, of the love for one's neighbor, and of the universal love, which concerns each existence and every individual life which crawls and flies in the expanse of the universe. In order, in truliness, to achieve prosperity and abundance, inwardly and outwardly, in good, healthy, positive, and fair form, it is necessary to set aside any efforts which are built upon unrighteousness and unvirtues, in order to then turn towards bringing one's inner nature to fruition, in accord with the model of one's innermost creational nature. In the position of the old, virtueless and unrighteous, wrong, unhealthy, ungood, and negative thoughts, one must place neutral, positive, equalized thoughts, which are occupied with imagining successful results, which are developed from corresponding ideals and are converted into reality by means of the might of the thoughts. These new thoughts and their might create a considerable amount of new, dynamic energy which is released, from which new ideas arise, which, transformed again into ideals and imaginations, lead to new achievements, and everything which appeared to be failures can be recognized as progress. The human being's progress is based in always thinking and acting evolutively, in a creative, constructive, kind, and wise. But being evolutive, creative, constructive also means that errors must be factored in and be processed and resolved. Therefore, prosperity and abundance are also not simply pure joy and sunshine. Rather, they are also furnished with things of darkness, which the human being must progressively recognize and penetrate in order to find his or her way to the light again. If that which is faulty, which the human being must recognize, resolve, and progressively change for the better, did not also exist in prosperity and abundance, then no evolution would come about, because he or she would only debauch in the prosperity and abundance and be inactive in progressing, whereby an evolutive stagnation would come about. It is only by prosperity and abundance, also containing errors, and that is in both the immaterial as well as the material sense, that the human being is called upon to continue to make the effort towards that which is better and higher, and therefore that which is progressive. Therefore the old proverb which says, "Whoever rests, rusts," is also valid here.